The barista rolled her eyes at the old woman in the corner, telling her she needed to order something or leave. 10 minutes later, a masked gunman burst through the door, forcing everyone to the floor. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She simply watched his hands, counting every mistake he was about to make. What happened next left the entire cafe speechless. And afterward, the owner pulled her aside privately and asked her a single question that had nothing to do with the robbery at all. Whether she remembered a little girl she'd once pulled from a burning building 22 years earlier, in a country neither of them had ever officially been allowed to name. The Amber Spoon occupied a corner storefront on a quiet downtown street, the kind of independent cafe that had built a loyal regular clientele over 8 years through good coffee and better patience with the ordinary chaos of daily foot traffic. It was a Wednesday morning, moderately busy, when Ren Talcott settled into a corner table near the window with nothing but a small paperback and no apparent intention of ordering anything at all. She was somewhere in her 60s, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a plain cardigan and carrying a canvas tote bag, the kind of quiet older customer who blended into a cafe's background so completely that most staff forgot she existed within minutes of noticing her. Delphine, the morning barista, had clocked Ren's untouched table for the better part of 20 minutes before her patience ran out. "Ma'am," Delphine said, approaching with the specific brisk efficiency of someone managing a full section during the morning rush. "This table's for paying customers. You need to order something or find somewhere else to sit." "I'm considering the menu," Ren said, her voice even, unbothered. "You've been considering it for 20 minutes, Delphine said, not quite unkindly, but firmly, the specific firmness of someone who'd had this exact conversation with a dozen different loiterers over the years. "I've got a line forming and a table you're occupying for free. I need you to either order or move along." A couple of nearby customers glanced up from their own tables, the specific mild interest of people grateful for a small distraction from their own mornings. Ren closed her book without any particular urgency. "I understand," she said. "Give me a moment." Delphine returned to the counter, muttering something under her breath that didn't quite carry, and Ren remained exactly where she was, her eyes drifting toward the cafe's front windows with the specific patient attention of someone watching something the rest of the room hadn't yet noticed. If something about this woman's calm is already sitting with you the way it should, this is a good moment to send this video to a friend who needs to see what happens in the next 10 minutes. The front door chimed at 9:43, and a man in a dark hooded jacket stepped through it wearing a ski mask, a handgun already raised and leveled at the room before anyone had fully processed what they were looking at. "Everybody down," he shouted, his voice cracking with the specific unstable energy of someone whose plan had already begun fraying at the edges before he'd finished his first sentence. "Down. Now, hands where I can see them." The cafe dissolved into chaos, customers dropping to the floor, a young mother pulling her toddler close against her chest, Delphine frozen behind the counter with both hands raised, her earlier brisk confidence entirely gone. Ren lowered herself to the floor along with everyone else, but she did it slowly, deliberately, her eyes already tracking the gunman's position, his stance, the specific way his weapon wavered slightly whenever his attention split between watching the room and watching the door. "Wallets, phones, whatever's in the register," the gunman said, moving toward the counter, his weapon still sweeping the room in short, jerky arcs. "Nobody's a hero, nobody gets hurt. Just give me what I need, and I'm gone." Delphine, hands shaking, began emptying the register with the specific fumbling slowness of someone whose fine motor control had abandoned her entirely under the pressure. "Faster," the gunman snapped, glancing toward the front window with visible nervousness, the specific behavior of someone acutely aware that every second in that cafe was a second closer to a police response he hadn't accounted for properly. Ren watched all of this from the floor with the specific patient attention of someone reading a situation rather than fearing it, cataloging his stance, his attention patterns, the particular rhythm of his glances toward the street. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to watch someone completely unprepared for the situation they've walked into, stay with us, because what Ren does over the next 4 minutes is going to change everything this cafe believes about the quiet old woman in the corner. The gunman's attention split further as a delivery truck pulled up outside, visible through the front windows, and his nervousness sharpened into something closer to genuine panic. "Hurry up," he said, voice rising, weapon swinging back toward Delphine with a jerk that made several customers flinch and press themselves harder against the floor. Rin rose from her position on the floor in one continuous, unhurried motion, closing the distance toward the counter before the gunman's divided attention had fully registered movement in the room at all. "You should put that down," she said, her voice carrying the specific calm authority of someone who had said versions of that sentence in circumstances considerably more dangerous than a Wednesday morning cafe robbery. The gunman spun toward her, weapon coming up, and found himself facing a woman he'd dismissed as harmless without a second glance the moment he'd walked through the door, now standing close enough that the distance between them had become, in the space of about 2 seconds, considerably more dangerous for him than for her. "Get back," he said, his voice cracking with genuine alarm now. Rin didn't get back. She closed the remaining distance in a single fluid motion, her hand finding his wrist and redirecting the weapon's arc away from the room in the same instant her other hand and hip combined into a technique that put him on the floor with a controlled, economical violence that had nothing wasted in it at all. The gun clattered from his grip, skittering across the tile floor well out of reach before he'd fully registered he was falling. The cafe went completely silent. "Subscribe. Actually, forget the formalities. Just stay with us, because what happens once the police arrive is only the beginning of what this Wednesday morning actually turns into." Ren secured the gunman's wrists with a length of cord she produced from her canvas tote bag, the same unhurried efficiency she'd carried through every version of the encounter, and rose to her feet, addressing the stunned room with the specific calm clarity of someone accustomed to managing chaos. "He's not going anywhere," she said. "Someone should call the police, if no one already has." Delphine, still frozen behind the counter, managed to nod and reach for the phone with visibly unsteady hands, dialing with the specific slowness of someone whose entire understanding of the last 5 minutes required considerable rebuilding before she could function normally again. The cafe's owner, a heavy-set man named Aurelio who had been in the back office during the entire encounter, emerged at the sound of the commotion finally settling and found a scene that took him a long moment to properly process. A masked man restrained on his cafe's floor, a room full of shaken customers slowly rising from where they'd taken cover, and an older woman in a cardigan standing calmly near the counter as though she'd simply finished an ordinary errand. Aurelio's eyes moved from the restrained gunman to Ren's face, and something in his expression shifted from confusion into a specific, careful recognition that had nothing to do with the robbery at all. "Ren," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight the rest of the room hadn't yet caught. Ren turned toward him, and something in her own composed expression softened slightly, the specific recognition of someone encountering a piece of considerably older history than the last 5 minutes had contained. "Aurelio," she said, "I didn't realize this was your place." 8 years, he said. "I bought it after I finally settled somewhere that felt permanent enough to build something." He studied her face a moment longer, the specific disbelief of a man cross-referencing a memory he'd never fully expected to need again. "You look exactly the way I remember, which doesn't make any sense at all given how long it's actually been. If you've ever wondered what it costs to carry an entire hidden history behind an ordinary morning, stay with us. Because what Aurelio says next is the reason this quiet cafe is about to become the site of a conversation neither of them ever expected to have again." Police arrived within 6 minutes, officers moving through the door with the specific brisk efficiency of a well-drilled response, finding a scene considerably calmer than the initial call had described. The gunman, still restrained, was taken into custody without incident, and a sergeant named Holloway spent the better part of 20 minutes gathering statements from customers still processing what they'd just witnessed. When Holloway reached Ren, he found the same unhurried, composed woman the rest of the cafe had already described to him in various states of continued disbelief. "Ma'am, can you walk me through what happened?" he asked. "He came in armed, demanded money, and I made sure nobody in this room got hurt while he did something considerably more dangerous than he understood," Ren said. "That's the entirety of what matters, as far as I'm concerned. Witnesses are describing what you did as considerably more than an ordinary intervention. Holloway said, glancing down at his notes. I need to understand your background before I can properly close this out. Ren considered the question, weighing exactly how much of an answer the moment actually deserved. I have experience with situations like this one, she said. A long time ago, in a professional capacity I don't discuss in detail. The training doesn't disappear just because the work did. Holloway didn't press further, the specific professional restraint of an officer recognizing an answer that wasn't going to expand no matter how he approached it, and moved on to close out his report with language careful enough to satisfy procedure without requiring further explanation. Once the police had finished processing the scene and most of the shaken customers had either given statements or quietly departed, Aurelio approached Ren again, his expression carrying a specific gravity that had settled into something more serious than the earlier shock of recognition. I need to ask you something, he said. It has nothing to do with what just happened here. It's about something considerably older. All right, Ren said. Do you remember a little girl, Aurelio said, his voice unsteady now, that you pulled out of a burning building 22 years ago, in a place neither of us has ever really been allowed to talk about by name? Ren went very still. Subscribe to Legendary Veterans, because what Aurelio reveals next is the reason this ordinary Wednesday morning turned into something neither of them will ever fully explain to anyone else in that cafe. There were several fires that year, Ren said slowly, her composed exterior cracking slightly for the first time since the gunman had walked through the door. Several children. I'd need more than that to know which one you're asking about. The compound near the river, Aurelio said. The one that collapsed during the extraction. You carried her out yourself, through a section of the structure that was already failing, because the evacuation route the rest of the team was using had already been cut off. I was part of the security detail assigned to that operation. I watched you go back in for her after everyone else had already written off that section as unrecoverable. How long have you known it was me? Ren asked. Just now, when I put that man on the floor. Or before that? Just now, Aurelio said. I've thought about that operation 1,000 times over the years, but I never had a name to attach to the person who actually carried her out. Command kept that information compartmentalized even from the rest of the security detail. All I knew was that someone went back into a structure everyone else had already abandoned as a loss. Watching what you just did to that gunman, the specific economy of it, the complete absence of hesitation, it's not something I'd seen more than once before in my life. It was enough to make me look at your face properly for the first time since you walked in here. Something shifted behind Ren's eyes, a slow recognition surfacing from a place she clearly hadn't visited in considerable time. The girl's name was Yeva, she said quietly. I never learned what happened to her afterward. The operation's aftermath scattered everyone involved before there was time for that kind of follow-up. She's my daughter, Aurelio said. I adopted her 18 months after that operation. Once the paperwork finally cleared through channels, I still don't fully understand. She's 24 now. She works 2 blocks from here. I've told her the story of the fire 100 times, and I never had a face to put with the woman who actually carried her out, because nobody who processed that extraction ever gave me a name I was allowed to keep. Ren was quiet for a long moment, the weight of 2 decades settling into the space between them in a way that had nothing to do with the robbery that had just concluded a few feet away. I didn't know, she said finally. I never knew what happened to any of the children from that operation. I made peace a long time ago with never knowing. Would you want to know now? Aurelio asked. She works right down the street. I could call her. I could tell her who's sitting in my cafe right now. Ren considered the question with a depth that suggested it reached considerably further than the practical logistics of a phone call. I don't know if I have the right to walk into her life 22 years later, she said. I did a job. I don't know that it earns me anything beyond having done it. It earned you the chance to find out what that job actually meant to someone, Aurelio said. That's not nothing. That might be considerably more than most people in your former line of work ever get to have. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting us, hit that like button, because what happens over the following hour is the reason this cafe's regulars still talk about the quiet Wednesday morning that turned into something none of them fully understood at the time. Aurelio made the call from behind the counter, his voice carrying a controlled excitement he could barely manage to contain, and 20 minutes later, a young woman in professional clothes pushed through the cafe's front door, her expression a mixture of confusion and cautious hope that had clearly been building since whatever brief, urgent explanation her father had managed to give her over the phone. Yeva stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the room until they found Ren sitting quietly at the same corner table where the entire morning had begun, and something in her posture shifted the moment she registered the woman she was looking at. "You found her," Yeva said, her voice unsteady, directed at her father, but her eyes never leaving Ren's face. "She found us, actually," Aurelio said, in a manner of speaking. Yeva crossed the cafe slowly, stopping a few feet from Ren's table, studying her face with the specific, careful attention of someone trying to reconcile a story she'd been told 100 times with the actual person standing in front of her for the first time. "I don't remember your face," Yeva said. "I was too young. I only remember the smoke, and someone carrying me, and my father telling me the story so many times afterward that I stopped being sure which parts one actually remembered and which parts I'd absorbed from hearing it repeated." "That's usually how memory works at that age," Ren said gently. "The story becomes the memory eventually. That's not a flaw. It's just how a mind protects itself from carrying something too heavy to hold onto directly." "Do you remember me?" Yeva asked. "Specifically, not just the operation." Ren considered the question with visible care. "I remember carrying a child through a section of a building that shouldn't have still been standing," she said. "I remember her crying, and I remember telling her to keep her eyes closed and hold on as tightly as she could, because I didn't have a free hand to reassure her with anything except my voice. I've carried that memory for 22 years without ever knowing if the child inside it grew up to have a life worth all the risk it took to get her out. Today, I finally know that she did." "What were the odds," Yeva asked, "of getting me out at all?" "My father's never told me the honest version, just that it was dangerous and that you were the only one willing to go back for me. The honest version is that most of the team assessed that section as unrecoverable," Ren said. "The structural risk was significant enough that the standard protocol would have accepted the loss and prioritized the extraction routes that were still viable. I made a different calculation. Not because I disagreed with the risk assessment, because I decided the risk assessment wasn't the only factor that mattered in that particular moment." "That sounds like it could have gotten you killed instead of just me saved." "It very nearly did," Ren said. "The section I carried you through collapsed almost entirely within 90 seconds of us clearing it. I've thought about those 90 seconds more times over the years than I could accurately count. I never regretted the decision. I did occasionally wonder if it had been worth what it nearly cost." "It was worth it," Yeva said, her voice breaking slightly. "I need you to know that. Whatever it nearly cost you, it was worth it." Yeva's eyes filled, and after a moment's hesitation, she closed the remaining distance and embraced Ren with the specific quiet intensity of someone finally closing a loop she hadn't realized. Until that exact moment, she'd spent her entire adult life leaving open. Aurelio watched from behind the counter, his own eyes bright, and Delphine, still processing an entire morning's worth of revelations she'd never expected an ordinary Wednesday shift to contain, found herself quietly wiping her eyes as well, her earlier brisk impatience with the woman in the corner feeling, in retrospect, like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. "I owe you an apology," Delphine said later, once the cafe had settled back into something resembling its ordinary rhythm, approaching Ren's table with visible embarrassment. "For how I spoke to you this morning. I had no idea." "You didn't need to have any idea," Ren said. "You were doing your job, managing a busy morning the way you're supposed to. I wasn't offended. I understand what an empty table with no order looks like from behind a counter." "Still," Delphine said, "I judged you the second I saw you. I decided exactly what you were before I had any information at all." "Most people do," Ren said. "The mistake isn't making that judgment. It's not staying curious enough to update it once the evidence changes right in front of you." Ren stayed at the Amber Spoon considerably longer than she'd originally planned that Wednesday, talking quietly with Yeva about the years between, about the life that had been built in the space the fire had nearly ended, about the specific, complicated gratitude of two people connecting a single terrifying moment to 2 decades of everything that had happened afterward because of it. She returned the following week, and the one after that, an arrangement that developed slowly into something neither Ren nor Yeva fully named out loud. but that both of them understood as considerably more than the ordinary coincidence of a robbery that had briefly, unexpectedly, reopened a door neither of them had known was still capable of opening. Some people carry an entire previous life folded up behind an ordinary Wednesday morning, and some ordinary mornings turn out to be the exact moment two of those previous lives finally intersect again, decades after either party assumed the connection had permanently closed. Ren Talcott had spent 22 years carrying the memory of a fire and a frightened child without ever knowing what became of either. It took one poorly planned robbery, one recognized face, and one father's willingness to finally ask a question he'd been carrying for decades to remind her that some of the most important consequences of a life like hers only reveal themselves considerably later, in the most unexpected corners of an otherwise ordinary day. If this story kept you here until the very last word, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the smallest, quietest actions we take sometimes echo considerably further into other people's lives than we ever get the chance to witness ourselves.